everyone. My name is Doug Erb, and I'm with Landshore. And today we're going to be doing what we call the Pepsi Challenge. And really, what this is a blind commission vendor selection. So it's effectively how to pick a solution that you truly want. Uh, the genesis of this really came about when we were talking. We met with many customers, and what we find is that a lot of times there's a predisposition to a certain vendor, whether it be that vendor is somebody you've worked with, which we do account for, had good or bad feelings for. But a lot of times you come in with a preconceived notion of who you're going to pick. So what you wanted to do is really turn that on its head and do a blind taste test of vendors and see what we came up with. So one moment about Landshore. Landshore is a services organization, does vendor selections. We're experts in that. We're also certified in many of the software applications that we'll be talking about. We have offices in Glasgow, London, and Houston here, and also down in San Jose, Costa Rica. Again, like I said here, as we're talking about in this slide, often we do vendor evaluations and we know the outcome before the evaluation. And back in 1979, it was like sitting down at the diner and saying, hey, I'm going to have a Coke. You kind of knew we were going to order a Coke all the way before you came in. And Pepsi said, well, wait a minute. We think we taste better, so let's do a blind taste test. And it's funny that we talk about the Pepsi challenge around this. There's also another challenge that was a blinded challenge that they did a long time ago, comparing California wines to French wines. I would say this is actually more applicable to that actual comparison than the Pepsi challenge, because of the nuances and differences in how you actually go about a vendor selection. Really isn't as simple as one or two things. It has all kinds of depth and breadth, like a wine tasting might. So we're going to go ahead and review the landscape, right? Then kind of way back when, what it looked like, how many players there were, how many players there are now, and just to get a good foundation of really what a daunting task a true vendor selection could look like. Once we do that, we're going to go through some of the typical criteria that we evaluate in an RFP. How do you come to the three, for example, that we're going to be testing? Why did we come to those three? Then we'll go through some of the visualizations, right? So you have reports, you have the admin councils and dashboards, things like that, workflow. So visualization is really important. A lot of time visualization is why a vendor is picked or how they're won. I would say a visualization is a key, and we'll get to that. However, it is one of the criteria, not all of them. So we want to make sure that we do pay attention to visualization, but not give it too much or more credit than it should be given. Ease of use, right? So we'll talk about ease of use, and then we'll go into some of the intangibles. All right. So I was doing my research, and I found this really interesting. I decided to see if I could find the earliest commissions article related to pretty popular publications like Gartner and whatnot. And so I did, and what I found was, as you can see here, everyone, when they go out and they try and sell you a commission system, talks about the error rate of spreadsheets being 6 to 8%. I always wondered where that number came from. And lo and behold, everyone who still tells you that is quoting a 20-year-old article by Joe Galvin from Gartner from 2001, which I thought was really interesting, because analysts estimate that errors associated in manual offline sales commissions, right, are 3 to 8%. I've heard that so many times. I wonder if it's factually accurate anymore. But this is something that's often quoted. And just to give you an idea of what things look like from then to now, and this isn't even 2020, this is 2018, and it's a small snippet based on Gartner, right? So you can see Obero and Iconics dropped off of Gartner, and Performio was added. And the little nuances that you can't see, obviously, is that IBM became Verisant, Calidus became SAP, and actually what you would see is probably in 2016, Synergy became Optimize. So you've got a lot of maneuvers even in that short time period. So what does that really mean from a vendor evaluation criteria? Well, it means that it's constantly changing, that you see new players and old players moving, being purchased, and that a lot of the preconceptions that you have about what you have for vendors from what you used before may indeed not be factually accurate anymore. But let's talk about what the vendor landscape, just from a sourced list that I have from the internet is. So what you see here is around 30, 35 different vendors just from one quick 20-minute list that I put together that I found on the internet. Um, and it's a lot, right? So if you were doing a vendor evaluation or just trying to do your own vendor evaluation, how would you know the difference between Concert and Connect, or that Javelin really is specific to healthcare industry, pharmaceutical, because it was built by a consultant company, or that SAP really is cloud commissions. Um, that Incentive Solutions is a very small company. Same thing for Broadridge Financials. That you have some up and comers like Captive IQ and Spiff that are getting funding. So you really wouldn't know that unless you do a lot of due diligence. And doing your due diligence and all of these can be very cumbersome. So having looked at all of those, that whole group, and looked at where we were and where we are now, how did we come up with the three to compare? Well, it wasn't really magic. What we decided was, we said, okay, well, let's talk about who we see the most, because that's probably who people would be interested in hearing about. So let's leverage our industry leaders. Um, Choose the ones that we implement most, the one that most people purchase. We kind of came up with a group there, based on those criteria and some of these other criteria, like what was their stack, did they have an open data model versus closed data model? Those are all kinds of things that we looked at and we said, okay, we really have some differentiators here such that it will be easy to distinguish the difference between these vendors. Now, what is interesting is if we get into a vendor evaluation and people are picking vendors that are really similar in technology and look and feel, then you get into some real nuances of, well, what's really the difference? And sometimes it might just be price as it applies to people. So what we came up with was, hey, we're going to use these three because they're different enough. They're widely used, widely known in some cases, and we can demonstrate utilizing things that we've captured from the internet, visualization. So all the visualization we did is off of screens that we were able to capture from internet web searches. We didn't actually use our confidentiality agreements to be able to go in the software and pick this stuff off. We wanted to make sure we adhere to our confidentiality. So when you look at this, there's some typical RFP questions you should be asking, right? One of them, obviously, hey, have you implemented someone like me? Now that's important because they'll understand the nuances of your organization. It's important in some cases. I'll say it's very important when it comes to insurance industry. In other industries, it's not as important. And the reason why I call it insurance is because there are specific government feeds that a lot of insurance agencies have to use, and they'll have to compare it against something someone sold to determine if they've got a license to be able to sell it. So there's criteria around certain industries that'll make it more beneficial for them to ask questions such as, "Hey, you've done our type before." In some cases, it doesn't really matter. You get into some retail sectors. Have you done a retail sector before? Have you done a software company before? Have you done, a lot of them really are commissioned in a similar fashion, although it's profit margin versus revenue, but the concepts are the same. You really don't have unique feeds coming in governmentally that have to be updated on an annual basis. So that's really a question a lot of people should have. What percentage? So this is really important because this tells a lot about a customer, about a vendor. Most of them have gone to SaaS. All right. What percentage of your SaaS customer churn do you have? Right. Are they retaining your services after 3 to 5 years, or are they bouncing off because they're not using it or it just didn't work out and they're looking for someone better? So looking at their industry churn can tell you a couple things. One, if the software is usable. Two, are they actually good at supporting their software? Are they a good friend? Are they a good partner? Do they work with you well? Right? Um, so, how does that look? How do customers specifically that are like you work with them, right? And this is where it would matter, right? If I'm a technology industry person and I've got, other technology companies find that they're meeting those criteria and like, okay, are you keeping your software up to date? And this is important for technology companies. It might not be important for effect manufacturing. So that is critical. Have any of your customers that you provide similar service to terminate their contract early, right? That's explainable, right? And it happens, right? But why do they terminate their contract early? What's going on? Ongoing costs to maintain the system, right? That's important because I need to know it's not just an initial setup. It's going to be what does it cost me on a go forward basis. And then the last one here that we have is what is the profile of someone who supports your system? Gets around ongoing costs. It's important because you want to make sure the type of profile that they provide meets the type of profile that you have in your organization. Otherwise, you're going to be hiring someone. And if you're hiring someone for a unique profile fit in your organization, that means they really probably won't have much upward mobility and they may be looking to exit your company soon. So you want to make sure that it's not so unique that you got to have someone that you're either overpaying for or that's going to quit. So let's get to some of the questions on how do our three vendors stack up. How our competitors stack up to common questions. So what is the ability to import and export information from source and destination systems is reformatting needed outside the system. This is really important because this will get to the crux of whether their data model is a fixed or open data model. All right. And by fixed, I mean that they are an application that says you will have to mold your data, your information to what my structure is and not me taking your information into my structure. This is one of the places where new organizations struggle the most that are part of the commission systems world because they're used to seeing the data and seeing their information in the format that they're used to and consuming it in that format and understanding what it means. And then all of a sudden I got to change it so that it goes into this system to calculate. So a lot of people get confused off of that. Others who've been in the industry know that, okay, well, it's a SaaS model in some cases, and in order for them to maintain the integrity of their database, they need to have something that allows them to keep rigidity around it so that the upgrades are less expensive, etc. So in our case, vendor one, they have an API that allows them to bring data in. However, it has to be massaged to fit their model. So vendor one is a closed data model, and it needs to have the information landed into their system. And they also have a box by which they do their own integration points. So it's pretty rigid for vendor one, getting data in and out. And getting data out can be very difficult at times because you're typically doing it as a report and not as a true extract. Vendor two is a little bit different. Data can be consumed in the same way it's landed. So if you have your own data format, you can bring it in, land it, and export it in the same way. Vendor two is very, very flexible, as well as vendor three in the way that they can handle information coming in and out from a customer. So these are what we would call open data models. And that's important to remember as you go ahead and start evaluating people specifically, again, if you're not IT heavy and you haven't gone through this before. So question number 2, what is the ability to associate a credit to a sales rep? How can you distribute credit to others? Okay, so this is something that happens a lot, right? Salesperson sells something, they receive credit for the sale of that item, right? Now, how that credit is determined can be done differently, right? Perhaps a sale happens in a territory, and I am a territory rep, and my name doesn't necessarily get stamped on a transaction, but I know that because I am in territory 77584 and a sale occurred in zip code 77584, for example, that I indeed should be getting credit for that sale. All right. So it's not that I was on the transaction, it's that I am a part or associated to the transaction through some other item. So secondly, do I have a manager by which I would roll that information up to effectively? So if we look at these questions, right? So how do people get tangential? There's distributed credit. How do I get independent credit? Vendor 1 generally requires a pre-credit association. So there's going to be some logic that you have to do outside the box to say, okay, this sales rep gets credit for this transaction, right? They do have rules that says, okay, well, which direction does that transaction go? Is it is it a, let's say an object or a something like a phone, let's say, or is it a plan, right? So they have the ability to distinguish once it's associated with the person where the bucket should go, how it should fall, and what type of credit behavior it should have. But getting it associated to the person is something that they don't do very well. They do allow for rolling of information from one person to another, which is critical. Vendor 2 allows for data to be filtered in the tool. So again, you can get information in. It'll filter that information based on the same type of criteria that I said, which is it could have a territory, could be stamped on there, and it's not necessary. However, it can run slow with large complex data sets requiring you to purchase additional optimization of their software. So if you're running heavy volumes and distributions of information, it can run slow, but it can actually do the work. You'll just have to get an optimized system, let's say. Vendor 3, again, they can do all that filtering in place and rolling of credit. However, vendor 3 is limited in the volume of transaction it can consume. So it has an actual upper bound threshold of data that it can consume, right? So for larger Fortune 500 companies, vendor 3 would probably not fit just based on that type of restriction. Okay, question 3. Ability to track a territory revenue goal and estimate an actual attainment percent for a sales rep. So how do you track it, right? So again, we have vendor 1, 2, and 3 here. Vendor 1, it's difficult to track revenue across calendar periods, right? So if I have revenue that crosses from 2020 to 2021, how do I track that? How do I make sure that it actually adheres if I've got calculations that are relying on each other? Vendor 1 has a hard time tracking that. It does allow for tracking territory and goal attainment based on actual data, so that's good. Again, vendor 2 can track cross calendar applications. The only thing that we say here about vendor 2 is it needs true expertise to ensure the application doesn't need to be corrected. What that means is there is some fundamental setup for vendor 2 that if it's not done right can be very problematic, right? And your entire application and the success of the application will rely on the person or people who are setting up fundamentally the foundations of the setup to begin with. I would say to a lesser extent, vendor 3, like vendor 2, needs a good foundational setup, but the expertise doesn't need to be as sophisticated to set it up properly because you can make modifications as needed for vendor 3. And again, here's cost. So we're doing a comparison against cost, cost to purchase and implement, and then there's ongoing cost. Vendor 1 is relatively expensive. It has a high ongoing cost based on the expertise required to maintain the system. Vendor 2 has a high and immediate initial cost. Ongoing costs can be kind of varied here. They can be the most if you don't do it right the first time because it's a re-implementation. Re-implementations are the most expensive. Or a good design allows it for a low maintenance cost. And what we find is vendor 3 typically is very low cost, isn't based on payees, it's a one-time purchase, and has low ongoing costs. Okay, so now we're going to get into user interfaces, which is really important. What's the look and feel for the application? Often we see vendors selected, like obviously on dashboards and reports. What we say is that's important, but it shouldn't be the entire reason why you make a purchase. So, vendor 1 dashboard report view. Obviously, you can see they've got a widget-based dashboarding report view. That means you can move information in and out as you want. You can change the widgets, and it actually hosts up and presents very well. You've got your traditional dials and bar charts, and you've got some speedometers up here in the upper left-hand corner. I will tell you, vendor 1 typically does very well in any vendor evaluation that we see, specific to presenting and presenting reports. They really focus on it. It's a key criteria of theirs. If we continue forward and look at vendor 1, their additional view. So here's an incentive statement from vendor 1, right? So this is what their commission statement looks like. Again, has aspects still of a dashboard, but also has some of the report-based aspects that you need in order to provide people with what they've gotten, what they've made. As we move forward to vendor 2, vendor 2's dashboard, what I will say is their dashboard here, I got off the internet, it looks really slick. This is not indicative of a typical dashboard. Most people don't put the background images, so what you would really see is what you're seeing is a pie chart, a dial, some bar charts. Not necessarily as advanced as some of the charting you see from vendor 1, but they actually have dashboards that you can build. I don't believe that their dashboards are widget-based dashboards, so you're going to have to come in and build out those dashboards concepts. And it would require someone with the knowledge of the system to build it out rather than someone who can just drag and drop widgets in and out of their reporting platform. Dashboard, the vendor dashboard review. So this is the performance summary for a payee. Looks pretty good. It's got some of their dashboarding concepts, obviously bar charts, bar charts here. And then their performance summary with a drill down capability. It's pretty slick. All right, dashboard number 3 looks amazing, I'm sure, to most of you people. It's got all the bells and whistles. It's even got the ability to do drop down for vendor number 3, drop down and pull information for those dashboards and display it. You've got bar charts, you've got line charts, you've got pie charts, and you've got information that's actually critical across the top. What I would say about dashboard number 3, or vendor number 3's dashboard, is it does require a fairly sophisticated developer to develop that dashboard. And it obviously shows as it's a very slick looking dashboard, but again, it's a fairly sophisticated dashboard. And when we go further, you can see even the same concepts of how it works together with a report, with the sales revenue report. You still have dashboard elements, and then you've got the elements of the commission statement. Not necessarily sophisticated. You don't see any link to information. What you have is drop down information based on those. So again, I'm gonna go back really quick so that you can see that here's dashboard and report. So this is the dashboard for vendor 1. Again, widget based, very slick, and easy to implement, and they're well known for these. This is their report view for their payee, commission summary, commission detail report. Again, very nice. Has link to and has some dashboarding elements, some very nice reporting elements. Report 2, again, nice, not necessarily as sophisticated. And then their report for the commission summary, commission detail, which has link to information. And then vendor 3, which really renders well, but is very sophisticated from a development perspective. Perfect. So let's move on from reporting to how hard is it to admin the system. And you'll get some pictures here of admin, and I'll go through my knowledge of adminning these systems. So first, vendor 1. Here's an idea of what it looks like to create pay rates and matrix or like a curve for vendor 1. Adminning the system for vendor 1 requires that you take, if you have not used their system before, it'll require that you take some classes to learn how to use their system. Is it terribly sophisticated? No. Does it line up in a very logical way? The answer to that is no also. Typically you find that vendor 1 type resources aren't well found. They're an in-demand commodity, and that most people don't want to wrap their career paths around learning this application and being an expert in this application. So oftentimes, if you run into something that's really sophisticated, you're going to have to consult or hire someone, either the vendor themselves or one of their partner vendors or partner service suppliers. Most of the companies I know will actually do a managed services with vendor 1 rather than even bother to have someone in-house learn the application and do it. Making simple changes like what you see here, which are percentage rates, aren't terribly difficult, but actually setting up the foundation and the fundamentals of the application can be very difficult themselves. Vendor 2, a little bit different, lays out in a data structured way, and so kind of gives you a visualization of how information ties together. What I find is that people who have knowledge of data structures can easily transform themselves into using vendor 2. Much differently than vendor 1, vendor 2 lays out in a visual way where data can be more easily understood, and therefore, again, you can find people in industry who can pick up application 2 a lot more easily than application 1 as it pertains to adminning the application itself. Now, having said that, people still, if you get into a situation where you had someone do a poor job of the initial setup of vendor 2, then you can run into a problem where you're going to be reliant on those people who either set it up or someone who's going to have to fix it. So vendor 2 really does lay out in a more graphical, logical way how information moves, how people get credit. It's more logically laid out, as you can see here with the lines. It gives you a really good idea of how things lay out. Plus, it's really oftentimes vendor 2 is more in your language. Vendor 3 is really about just to give themselves away of who vendor 3 is. But vendor 3 lays out logically. Everybody knows how to use vendor 3. So finding someone who's an expert in vendor 3 shouldn't be terribly difficult. And as you can see, it's very, very simplistic in its use. I'm not going to go into vendor 3 too much because you probably should have a pretty good idea who they are now. So, other intangibles. What are some of the other things about the vendors that you should be concerned about? Like workflow, right? Is it robust or is it just good enough? So if I think about all the vendors, vendor 1 really doesn't have a good workflow module, right? So it's not something they do. They have the basic. Vendor 2, a little bit better, but still very basic and very difficult. And obviously vendor 3 doesn't have a inherent workflow module, but you can get as sophisticated as you want with vendor 3 as long as you know how to program software code language. So if I were to line up their workflow, realistically, vendor 3 could have the most robust, but it'll cost you. And the other two really don't have workflow that I would say is more than lightweight. Whereas I do think vendor 2's workflow module is probably miles ahead of vendor 1. True territory and quota management, none of the three have true territory and quota management. They don't have no modules that really manage it in that way. There are other vendors who do, but that's not their key. Um, One is the high financial health and vision of these organizations. So they all three have really good health from a financial position and vision. I would say the vision is different, obviously, between the vendors. Whereas vendor 2 has been trying to get ahead and get on the forefront of technology. Vendor 3 is at the forefront of technology. Vendor 1 lags in what I would say vision outside of its core capabilities. Now that might be what most people are looking for also, but I will say that they're not looking at how you approach automation in new formats. They're looking at things that are critical to commissions, like obviously how do we report commissions, but they're not really taking their tool much further than that. And they're all three financially healthy, so that's not a real concern. How do they manage their support? Whereas vendor 3 generally, they expect their users or customers to be able to support that application. Vendor 1 and vendor 2, they have call-in support. They also have pretty robust partner network support. Obviously, vendor 3 does also. So in managing their support, I would actually give vendor 1 a leg up on everyone because they have uh, a very customer-centric support model, and it's known very well. Uh, Vendor 2 is getting there. They had just spun out from an acquisition, so they're still working on their support model. In Vendor 3, you call a phone number for support. If you want data out, do you have to use them? Yes. So vendor 1, if you want your data extracted, you want anything out of that system, you're going to have to call them to get it. Vendor 2, you don't. You can get it out, and vendor 3, you can get out your information on your own. That becomes incredibly important when you have to get information to finance. If you want to make changes, if you're not happy, say you want to leave them, right? It's a lot easier to leave vendor 2 and vendor 3 than it is vendor 1. They wrap you in, they don't allow you to get your data out. So it becomes very difficult. So I've gone through a lot of things here, hit real high points. So the question I would have is, obviously, from what you've seen, which again is a 30-minute webinar, which one would you think that you like the most, not just graphically, but hit some of the high points that you had? And we'll have a upcoming selection based off of this so people can see who they picked. But for the purposes of this webinar, vendor 1 was Exactly, vendor 2 was Verisent, and vendor 3 was Microsoft Excel.